Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like the moment an army appeared on the horizon? Not the soldiers, not the generals whose names we memorize in history books, but the baker, the farmer, the child standing barefoot in the dust. Imagine you're living in a small village 2,000 years ago. The sun is just rising. Bread is baking. A dog is barking at absolutely nothing, as dogs often do. And then someone climbs the hill and freezes. There is a line on the horizon. Not clouds, not birds. Men, thousands of them. And in that moment before a single sword is drawn, your life has already changed. If stories like this pull you in, take a second to gently tap that subscribe button. Maybe leave a like if you feel it's worth it, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I always love seeing how far these quiet little history journeys travel. Now, dim the lights a little, let the room settle, and let's walk slowly into the dust together. Picture Gaul in the 1st century before Christ, a farming community somewhere along the route of Julius Caesar's campaigns. Roman legions were marvels of discipline, organised, structured, efficient. Each soldier carried nearly 80 pounds of equipment. They built roads, they built camps, they followed orders, but they also ate. A single Roman soldier needed roughly 2 pounds of grain per day. Now multiply that by 5,000 men in a legion. That is 10,000 pounds of grain every single day. And that does not include the horses, the officers, the engineers, the camp followers. Ancient armies did not have refrigerated trucks trailing behind them. They had your wheat field. The phrase historians use is almost gentle living off the land. It sounds peaceful, almost pastoral. In reality, it meant your barn was emptied before winter. Your livestock was taken. Your stored grain meant to carry your children through the cold months disappeared in an afternoon. Even disciplined armies strained the land, and not all armies were disciplined. When Alexander the Great marched across Asia in the 4th century before Christ, his army at times exceeded 40,000 men. Cities that resisted could be sacked. The city of Tyre, after a long siege, was brutally punished. Civilians paid the price for strategic decisions made far above their heads. And then centuries later, the Mongol invasion swept across Central Asia and Eastern Europe. Some cities that surrendered were spared. Others that resisted were erased almost entirely. Chroniclers describe streets silent except for smoke. We often imagine ancient warfare as glorious battles between armoured heroes. But for civilians, the true terror was not the clash of swords. It was the waiting, the watching, the realisation that survival had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with whether your village happened to stand in the path of ambition. And here is the part we rarely think about after the army moved on. The battle was not over for you. Your harvest was gone. Your oxen were gone. Winter was still coming. Famine often followed troop movements more reliably than victory parades. Archaeological evidence across parts of the Roman frontier shows abandoned farmsteads in zones repeatedly crossed by armies. Not because every villager was killed, but because staying simply became impossible. History books remember the general who conquered the territory. They rarely remember the farmer who could not replant his field. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear him. And this was only the beginning. Because as we move forward into the medieval world, something changes. Armies do not just pass through. Sometimes they come specifically to burn, and that story is even darker. Now let us move forward a few centuries. The castles are taller. The armour is heavier. Knights swear oaths of honour beneath fluttering banners. If Hollywood had existed in the 14th century, it would have had excellent material. But if you were a farmer in northern France during the 100 Years' War, romance was the last word you would use. Instead of a single marching column passing through, something more deliberate began to happen. Armies started targeting the countryside itself. The English developed a strategy called the chevauchée. It sounds almost elegant, does it not? In practice, it meant riding fast and wide through enemy territory, burning crops, destroying mills, cutting down orchards, and slaughtering livestock. The goal was not just to defeat an opposing army. It was to break the economy that fed it. In the year 1346, during one of these campaigns, English forces under King Edward III rode through Normandy, leaving a trail of destroyed villages behind them. Chroniclers describe entire regions set ablaze. The smoke could be seen for miles. Imagine standing in your doorway watching men on horseback torch the field your family had planted in spring. What would you save first? The grain, the children, the family Bible. Medieval warfare was often sold as chivalry, knights in shining armour, codes of honour. But honour rarely applied to peasants. Tax records from late medieval France show dramatic drops in revenue in regions repeatedly crossed by armies. Not because the king suddenly became generous, because there was simply nothing left to tax. And then came sieges. When towns were surrounded, civilians inside the walls suffered terribly. During the Siege of Calais in 1346 to 1347, food shortages became so severe that horses, dogs, and even leather were consumed. Starvation does not care about loyalty. Here is the uncomfortable truth in medieval Europe: destroying farmland was often more effective than winning a battle. If the harvest failed, soldiers could not be paid. If soldiers could not be paid, wars stalled. So when armies passed through, they did not just take supplies. They targeted survival itself, and yet people endured. Villages rebuilt. Fields were replanted. Communities adapted, hiding grain, moving livestock, sometimes even negotiating with passing forces to reduce damage. Have you ever thought about how much of history is really the story of ordinary people quietly rebuilding after powerful men finished fighting? Because as Europe moved into the early modern era, something changed again. Armies grew larger, governments stronger, bureaucracies more organised. And when those new massive armies began to move, the scale of civilian suffering expanded in ways the medieval world had never seen. As Europe stepped into the 17th century, warfare did not become kinder. It became bigger. Armies were no longer a few thousand men on horseback. They were swelling into forces of 30,000, 50,000, sometimes more. And when numbers grow, hunger grows with them. The 30 Years' War, which began in 1618 and dragged on for 3 decades across Central Europe, offers one of the clearest windows into what civilians endured when armies did not simply pass through once, but returned again and again. In parts of the German state's population, losses reached 20 to 40%. Not all from battle. In fact, most deaths came from famine and disease. Soldiers requisitioned grain. Then another army came and requisitioned what little remained. Then disease followed weakened bodies. Imagine trying to plant crops knowing another army might trample them before harvest. One Protestant pastor from the region of Württemberg wrote of villages where no dogs barked, no cattle lowed. The silence was not poetic. It was empty. And here is something many people do not realise: even when armies were technically on your side, they could still devastate you. Commanders issued contributions demanding money, food and shelter. Failure to comply could lead to violence. Payment was sometimes promised. It was not always delivered. By the time the war ended in 1648, entire regions were economically shattered. Forests had reclaimed farmland. Trade routes collapsed. Generations grew up knowing nothing but instability. Then, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, came another transformation. Napoleon Bonaparte commanded armies of unprecedented size. During the invasion of Russia in 1812, more than 600,000 troops crossed the border. Even with improved administrative systems, that many men could not be fed without drawing heavily from local resources. The Russian strategy of scorched earth meant villages were burned to deny food to the French. Civilians lost homes to stop an invader. French soldiers starving during the retreat stripped anything edible from the countryside. Have you ever considered what it feels like to lose your house not because of an enemy, but because your own army burns it for strategy? War was no longer just raids or sieges. It had become national, industrial in scale, bureaucratic in its demands. And as governments became stronger, civilians were pulled more tightly into the machinery of war. Taxes rose, young men were conscripted, horses and carts were seized. The battlefield was expanding beyond fields and into everyday life. And then the 20th century arrived, bringing with it a new idea that would erase the boundary between home and front line entirely. And then, almost without warning, war stopped knocking on the door. It came through the sky. When the First World War erupted in 1914, governments told their citizens it would be over by Christmas. Instead, it stretched on for 4 brutal years, and something fundamental shifted. Civilians were no longer simply in the path of marching troops. They became part of the strategy. The British naval blockade of Germany restricted food imports so severely that by 1917 what Germans called the turnip winter set in. Potatoes failed, bread was rationed, malnutrition spread. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of German civilians died from hunger and related disease during the war, not on the battlefield, at the dinner table. Think about that for a moment. No army needed to pass through your street. Starvation could arrive silently, carried by policy and sea power. Then came the Second World War, and the phrase total war became reality. In London during the Blitz between 1940 and 1941, more than 40,000 civilians were killed in aerial bombing. Families slept in underground stations for safety. Children were evacuated to the countryside. Imagine being 8 years old and waving goodbye to your parents at a train station, not knowing when you would see them again. On the Eastern Front, entire villages were destroyed as German and Soviet forces clashed. In places like Belarus and Ukraine, civilians were executed in reprisal actions. The line between combatant and non-combatant blurred until it nearly disappeared. And in Japan, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, tens of thousands of civilians were killed instantly. Others suffered radiation sickness for years afterward. War had reached a point where a single weapon could erase a city. Here is the chilling truth: by the mid-20th century, civilians were not just collateral damage. They were considered legitimate targets because industry, transportation, and morale were all seen as part of the war effort. Factories were bombed because they made tanks. Railways were bombed because they moved soldiers. Cities were bombed because breaking civilian morale was thought to weaken the enemy. Have you ever wondered how you would live if sirens could sound at any moment? And yet, even in that darkness, resilience emerged. Neighbours pulled strangers from rubble. Communities rebuilt from ruins. After 1945, cities like Warsaw and Dresden rose again from devastation. War had become industrial, mechanised, airborne, but so had recovery. And as the world stepped into the modern era, nations tried to answer a haunting question. If civilians suffer the most, can they be protected at all? That question shapes the conflicts we see today. By the middle of the 20th century, the world had seen enough ruin to ask a new question. If civilians always suffer when armies move, can the world finally protect them? After the Second World War, nations gathered to rewrite the rules. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 expanded protections for civilians in wartime. On paper, it was a turning point. Civilians were no longer an afterthought. They were legally recognised as protected persons. Targeting them deliberately became a war crime. It sounded like progress, and in many ways it was. But war did not disappear, it changed shape. Instead of vast front lines stretching across continents, many conflicts shifted into cities. Urban warfare became one of the defining features of modern conflict. And cities are not empty battlefields. They are apartment buildings, hospitals, grocery stores, schools. Think about Aleppo during the Syrian civil war. Entire neighbourhoods reduced to concrete shells. Or Mariupol in 2022, where residential blocks were heavily damaged during intense fighting. In modern conflicts, more than half of the world's refugees are civilians displaced from urban areas. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, by 2023, over 100 million people worldwide were forcibly displaced due to conflict, violence, or persecution. 100 million. That is not a number. That is families. That is bedtime stories interrupted. That is dinner tables left set. Modern armies may not always march in long visible columns anymore. They arrive with armoured vehicles, drones, artillery, power grids fail, water systems collapse, supermarket shelves empty within days. And yet something remarkable continues to happen. Civilians adapt. In besieged cities, people form volunteer networks to deliver food. Doctors operate in underground clinics. Parents create makeshift classrooms in basements so children can still learn multiplication, while artillery echoes outside. Have you noticed this pattern across every century we have explored? Armies move, destruction follows, but so does rebuilding. The farmer replants, the shopkeeper reopens, the teacher gathers children again. The story of civilians when armies pass through is not only a story of suffering, it is a story of endurance, of ordinary people absorbing the shock of history and somehow continuing. And now as we step back and look across centuries from ancient dust clouds to satellite images of modern cities, a deeper pattern begins to emerge, because understanding that pattern might change the way we see war itself. By the middle of the 20th century, the world had seen enough ruin to ask a new question. If civilians always suffer when armies move, can the world finally protect them? After the Second World War, nations gathered to rewrite the rules. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 expanded protections for civilians in wartime. On paper, it was a turning point. Civilians were no longer an afterthought. They were legally recognised as protected persons. Targeting them deliberately became a war crime. It sounded like progress, and in many ways it was. But war did not disappear, it changed shape. Instead of vast front lines stretching across continents, many conflicts shifted into cities. Urban warfare became one of the defining features of modern conflict. And cities are not empty battlefields. They're apartment buildings, hospitals, grocery stores, schools. Think about Aleppo during the Syrian civil war. Entire neighbourhoods reduced to concrete shells. Or Mariupol in 2022, where residential blocks were heavily damaged during intense fighting. In modern conflicts, more than half of the world's refugees are civilians displaced from urban areas. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, by 2023, over 100 million people worldwide were forcibly displaced due to conflict, violence or persecution. 100 million. That is not a number. That is families. That is bedtime stories interrupted. That is dinner tables left set. Modern armies may not always march in long visible columns anymore. They arrive with armoured vehicles, drones, artillery. Power grids fail. Water systems collapse. Supermarket shelves empty within days. And yet something remarkable continues to happen. Civilians adapt. In besieged cities, people form volunteer networks to deliver food. Doctors operate in underground clinics. Parents create makeshift classrooms in basements so children can still learn multiplication, while artillery echoes outside. Have you noticed this pattern across every century we have explored? Armies move, destruction follows, but so does rebuilding. The farmer replants, the shopkeeper reopens, the teacher gathers children again. The story of civilians when armies pass through is not only a story of suffering, it is a story of endurance, of ordinary people absorbing the shock of history and somehow continuing. And now as we step back and look across centuries from ancient dust clouds to satellite images of modern cities, a deeper pattern begins to emerge, because understanding that pattern might change the way we see war itself.